Welcome to ReScape Partnership Program's Earth Day celebration. We are endlessly grateful to have you all here. We are recording this presentation to allow people who couldn't make it to the live showing to be able to see it. We'll be posting the recording to Hay Summit and our YouTube channel until April 29th, which is about 1 week after we end this whole program. My name is Jean Duvin. I'm the manager of the partnership program. Ryan Diocampo is here with me as well. He's the training coordinator and my co-pilot. We are so thrilled, and I was saying yesterday, a little sad to be in our 8th and final week of our first partnership program, but we're excited for this week and more to come after we wrap. The partnership program, for those who are new to this whole series, is an expansion of ReScape's established body of work in regenerative whole systems landscape education and policy, as presented through our 8 principles. In 2018, when the IPCC estimated that there were a mere 10 years left to stop and reverse our direction in climate change, our executive director, who's also here today, Milena Fiore, established a consortium of partners all over the world to address this most urgent topic and create a course of action. This consortium of partners is what morphed into the partnership program that you've all been attending and are here today attending. Through this program, we strive to reach more communities and more industries in the fight to save our planet. Our highest goal is to unite these establishments, people, businesses, and communities in our shared efforts and inspire action right now. We are in week 8, which highlights Create Habitat. And today we're so excited to hear from Sharon Selvaggio and Aaron Anderson, presenting Supporting Biodiversity Through Pollinator Plantings and Avoiding Pesticide Exposure. Please feel free, as both Sharon and Aaron are presenting, to write any questions or comments that you have in our chat thread. I will capture them and discuss them at the end during the Q&A. We are also so pleased to be showcasing our vendor for this week, Born to Roam Vintage. Born to Roam is a curated collection of men's and women's vintage clothing made between the 1960s and the 1990s. These items are handpicked, mended, laundered, and hung to dry in the warm California sun. Many of the items are also dyed with botanical dyes that are made responsibly from wild harvested or homegrown plants, an element that brings new life and color to clothing in a non-toxic, chemical-free method. We're celebrating this business this week because they're creating a habitat of value and awareness around upcycling in our communities, which is really important in the fashion industry. A big thank you also to our main sponsors of the Earth Day Partnership Program, Gachina Landscape Management and Linkso Gardening Materials, both longtime supporters of ReScape and big supporters of our partnership program. We like to try and welcome each other as best we can in this virtual setting, so please turn on your cameras for a brief moment, show your face, and write your name and what city you're currently sitting in. We always love to know how you found out about us, work, friends, ReScape newsletter, most of you maybe through the Xerces Society, which is so amazing. And not to forget, this Earth Day celebration is a fund and friend raiser. All events are free, and we always like to ask you to consider donating to one of our 5 funds in any capacity you can in exchange for all this wonderful information you're receiving from esteemed guests. And before we get to our presentation from Aaron and Sharon, we're going to open with a brief intro into ReScape and the work that we do. And for that, I'll pass over to Ryan, our training coordinator.
Yes, thank you, Jean. Welcome, everyone. So excited to have you here on our 8th and final week. Really, maybe one of the most esteemed weeks that we have here. Really excited for Sharon and Aaron to join us. As you see, we are in our 8th week. Welcome, everyone. Just to give you a little background on ReScape and the work we do, ReScape provides a regenerative whole systems watershed foundation to landscaping education, workforce development and policy, addressing climate change, earthscape, and land use issues. And here we'd like to acknowledge and honor the indigenous groups and cultures that subsisted on the lands prior to our arrival to California. It's extremely important to us that we recognize and respect their existence, and we encourage you to learn more about the indigenous peoples in your region. And here is a beautiful kind of chart of all the various cultures and tribes throughout California. Our work at ReScape, we do train individuals. We have trained over 3,000 landscape professionals employed by over 97 public agencies and hundreds of private businesses. Our regenerative principles are incorporated into municipal ordinances, permitting requirements, city general plans, regional stormwater permits, technical guidelines, and sanitary district resolutions. Our focus can be categorized into 3 areas, one of which diverse workforce training. It pertains to ReScape's efforts to train professionals from a range of industry, education, cultures, economic levels, ages, genders, and we recognize these experiences are essential to revenue generating and business success and to address the climate issues that we're facing. Climate equity is a note that we realize that approaches to landscaping and land use must include and listen to communities of concern, and it's those who are lacking access and those who are unequally affected by a warming planet. We aim to build opportunities for the most vulnerable populations because we understand circumstances and access to resources are not proportionally distributed. And we do this by advocating for state and regional policies, permits, and ordinances that encourage and enable implementation and compliance in regenerative land use. And this is an important note for us and everyone here. The UN IPCC released its latest climate change report a couple weeks ago on the mitigation of climate change, which highlights climate vulnerability and the importance of adaptation. We're going to be dropping some links into the chat to get you copies of these reports. We know that strengthening nature can deliver up to 1/3 of emissions reductions needed by 2030, and we each have a part in that. Nature-based climate solutions offer an opportunity to address both climate and nature crises and generate significant additional environmental, social, and economic benefits. And with that report, the administration for Newsom came out with a series of documents that comprise a California climate adaptation strategy. And the last update was in 2018, but the current report breaks down silos and unifies collective climate adaptation efforts across all sectors and regions. The update also makes it easier for all Californians to understand and contribute to California's climate resilience agenda. And here we have just kind of a deeper dive into the regions and that the reports are divided into, and we encourage you to check out those links to see some more kind of localized regional details on areas where you live. Here's a visual representation of our week 8 featured vendor, Born to Roam. We'd also like to do another huge shout out to Linkso and Kachina. Thank you so much for your involvement. And for those of you that are familiar with ReScape, you might know that we have 8 principles that kind of creates our foundation. And for those that are learning, wanted to kind of discuss those: act local, reduce waste, nurture soil, sequester carbon, save water, conserve energy, protect water and air, and the create habitat principle, which we're currently celebrating in week 8. These principles certainly extend beyond the landscaping industry, and I like to apply them to my own personal life as well. So you get the whole spectrum of their value. One thing at ReScape, we have a rated landscape program. And this is a huge benefit for us and for everyone. We certify regenerative landscapes via scorecard system. And this scorecard is similar to the LEED's Green Building Certification scorecard. And as you see here, there are some percentages in savings in certain areas like maintenance and water, weed suppression, and reduction in greenhouse gases. At ReScape, we also have qualified trainings for design, maintenance, and firescaping. We do advanced trainings. We do qualification renewal trainings for those who are extending their qualifications. And we do webinars and workshops similar to the one you're enjoying today. And upcoming, we do have a few trainings in the future, one of which is our maintenance qualification training coming up here at the beginning of May. We are also providing a discount code of 10% off if you use this code here that's on our screen to get signed up for this week. Just a great kind of benefit for everyone. You also see kind of a brief kind of course overview on the right side there. Furthermore, we have a MWELO for plant checkers and inspectors webinar coming up May 25th. Definitely check this out. There's some great information on our website as well that I'm sure those links are being dropped into the chat for our calendar and for our directory here. We have a design qualification training that's in the works here, planning for the late summer, so stay tuned as well. Those will be updated on our calendar as they come. We also have a firescaping qualification training we're organizing for the fall as well, so please stay tuned for that. Furthermore, we have a landscape designers and architects focus for MWELO webinar here, and that's September 30th. Lots of detailed information for those who are interested and to learn more about the legislation in California. Another one of our proud offerings is our qualified professionals directory. This is an example scorecard or an example card for one you might find in that directory with information on their business, the counties they serve, their services, and just a lot of details. So, please check out our directory. There's an amazing list of qualified professionals, consultants, and those who can help you in projects from small to large. And as you may be aware, we're approaching Earth Day, celebrating on Friday here. However, we've been celebrating it kind of for the last 8 weeks. But ReScape is a partner for earthday.org. And if you want to check out more information about what's going on across the globe or how to get involved, there's amazing resources on their webpage. There's also a map that kind of shows just events and organizations and activities all over the world. Kind of a fascinating expose into the world's efforts to mitigate climate change. And before I hand it over, just want to say thank you for joining us. And I'm sure you've had enough of me talking, but would love to get you excited for our speakers today. And Jean's going to do a quick bio on them before we hand it over to them. Thank you again for joining us. I'm going to exit the screen show and thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, before you guys get too sick of our talking, just a little bit more. Both Aaron Anderson and Sharon Selvaggio are pesticide program specialists at the Xerces Society of Invertebrate Conservation. Sharon Selvaggio assists Xerces staff, partners, and the public to reduce reliance on pesticides and understand pesticide risk to invertebrates. Sharon previously worked at the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Forest Service, and integrates her focus on pesticides with her experience managing natural areas and agricultural lands. Sharon earned a Master of Science in Energy and Resources and a Bachelor of Arts in Biology, both from the University of California, Berkeley. Aaron Anderson works with the public and Xerces staff to reduce pesticides use in residential landscapes, including promoting alternative pest control measures and pollinator-friendly gardening practices. Prior to joining Xerces in 2022, he researched pollinator conservation in urban landscapes, restored habitat for several endangered butterfly species, and worked in insect biocontrol. In 2021, he was an AAAS Mass Media Fellow at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where he reported science and business stories. Aaron recently, also congratulations, finished his PhD at Oregon State University, where he worked to identify the best native pollinator plants for use in residential landscapes by looking at the needs of both pollinators and gardeners. So thank you both, Aaron and Sharon. We're very eager to hear the presentation you've got prepared, and I'll pass over to you, Aaron.
Great, thank you so much, Jean. Let me share my screen here. Let's see. All right, can everybody see it? We're good? Excellent. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the whole ReScape team for organizing these Earth Day webinars and inviting us to speak. Yeah, my name's Aaron. I'm a pesticide program specialist with the Xerces Society. And yeah, I'll be tag teaming this talk with my colleague, Sharon. And we'll be speaking to you today about supporting biodiversity through pollinator plantings. And an important component of that, avoiding pesticide exposure. And happy almost Earth Day to everybody. So I wanted to give you a quick outline so you all know where we're headed with this talk. I'll give some quick background on us as an organization, and then we'll start with some basics on pollinator and invertebrate conservation and why it's important. Then we'll dive into talking about habitat in towns and cities. And Sharon will tell us about reducing reliance on pesticides through using ecologically based integrated pest management. So if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society, we've been around since 1971, working to conserve and protect invertebrates and their habitat. Our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. And it actually lived kind of near where ReScape is based, in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco. So I wanted to touch real quick on how invertebrates really are the little things that run the world. They pollinate, they decompose, provide food, filter water. They truly help our world function. So in this slide on the left is a tall blazing star with a monarch butterfly. This is one of the most popular monarch nectaring plants. And then on the right is a western pearl shell, which is a mussel that can live to be up to a century old. And it forms dense beds that consist of tens of thousands of individual mussels. And they just quietly filter out water and improve river habitat for other species. So both of these examples, of course, provide these amazing ecosystem services. As I just said, the pearl shell mussel is an important water filter, and then monarchs and other butterflies are pollinators. But I just kind of wanted to throw this in. I think more than just being important parts of ecosystems, invertebrates are simply captivating in their own right. And one reason to conserve them is because I think we should all be able to experience the magic of watching bees visit flowers in a garden or a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis. So to conserve species like those, the Xerces Society does a variety of on-the-ground conservation work, with programs working on conservation in a variety of landscapes, endangered species work, pesticide education, as well as community engagement. And on this slide, I have some photos of some representative species and habitats that we work in. So you see everything from mussels to butterflies, bees, dragonflies, in urban, rural, agricultural, natural landscapes. We also provide detailed science-based guides and educational materials for protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. So this ranges again from native mussel species in streams to beneficial insects in your yard. So I really encourage you to visit our website for free national and regional resources on plants, pollinators, and other invertebrates. And this library is really decades of work on protecting these organisms and is a great resource. Okay, so I want to touch on declining insect diversity and abundance. So many of you are likely already aware of this, but there have been more and more studies documenting declines in insect populations and communities worldwide. And basically all of the metrics we use to describe insect populations, decreased abundance, lower species richness, even decreased overall biomass in entire ecosystems. So a study that garnered a lot of attention in 2017 measured overall flying insect biomass at sampling sites in Germany, and they found a 76% decline over 26 years, which is incredibly stark. This data is patchy since many insects aren't carefully monitored, but the data we do have, almost all points to these decreases in populations. And we know enough to know that it's essential to take action to conserve pollinators and other insects. And I want to add as a side note, that's why investing time and resources in monitoring pollinators is so important. An example is our bumblebee atlases that the Xerces Society do, and the California one is launching this year. So I encourage anybody who's interested to go to our website and learn how you can volunteer. So the causes of these observed insect declines are thought to be due to several key drivers. And a major one is habitat loss, and in particular due to agricultural intensification. This is especially when there's large monocrops that produce really no food for pollinators, think corn and soybeans, especially because these areas typically also have high amounts of pesticides applied to them, and row-to-row farming that eliminates any, essentially weedy species that also provide resources for pollinators. There's also been accelerating land use change, in particular urban sprawl in many parts of the country and world. And given that the estimate is that 70% of people will live in a city by 2050. I guess this isn't surprising, but urban sprawl, like this photo, on the top on this slide, show really how this type of land use change can dramatically degrade habitat. Invasive species are also a concern, as they can outcompete native host plant species that insects rely on and change ecosystems. And climate change is another major driver. So the effects of some of these other things like urbanization are kind of exacerbated with climate change. Warming temperatures can shift species ranges, which is especially problematic for species that exist on the edge of a range or at high elevation. And yeah, in a 2018 study, researchers found that bee abundance decreased by 41% per degree Celsius of warming in urban areas of Raleigh, North Carolina. And this was regardless of the floral diversity present. So the quality of habitat couldn't compensate for the impact that the warming temperature had on these bee populations. Pathogens and disease are a big concern. And then also, finally, what Sharon and I spend a lot of time working on, pesticide use. Insecticides kill insects directly, and in low quantities can still have impacts on insects, what are called sublethal effects, like diminished reproduction, diminished colony growth, and even impacting the ability of bees to navigate and forage for food. And even pesticides thought to be safe for insects like certain fungicides are recently drawing more scrutiny as studies are finding negative impacts and even synergistic effects with certain insecticides. And I should also note that herbicides can contribute to habitat loss as well, as they remove flowering weed species from the landscape. So when we make our spaces tidy by removing plant diversity and then using pesticides, we're really making those spaces hostile to most insect life. Okay, so I want to touch on why this matters. Why do we care? So about 25% of bird and mammal diets consist of pollinator-produced seeds and fruits. And pollinators and other insects are really important food sources for other wildlife as well. In fact, 89% of birds eat insects. So these species and the plants that support them really serve as the base of, I guess, what you could think of as the food chain. This is why quality habitat is so important. It really supports the needs of all wildlife, not just the ones you're interested in conserving. So why this matters, looking at pollinators. So pollinators in particular have received a lot of attention, and we at the Xerces Society really work hard to protect them. And this is because pollinators are just incredibly important for natural systems. More than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, and mostly insects, to move pollen, which allows these plants to reproduce and continue reseeding in their environments. In addition, the seeds and fruits, as I was mentioning earlier, produced by pollination, are food sources for so many other types of wildlife, from birds to mammals. And by just moving pollen from flower to flower, pollinators just help build out that base of the food chain for many species. And then, of course, for us as humans, diverse pollinator communities are really important for sustaining, our productive agricultural lands. Many of our food crops are dependent on pollination, and bees in particular are responsible for that. So I want to quickly talk about native bees, which is what we're generally talking about trying to conserve. So there are more than 3,600 native bee species in the United States. And I believe I read that there's about 1,600 in California alone. So everybody who's located in California, you have a lot of bees. And about 2/3 of them are ground nesting bees, meaning they live below ground. And the only sign of their nests at all are tiny little holes in the ground, like that middle photo on the slide. The other third lives above ground, and these are called cavity nesting bees. So these live in holes in like old woods and pithy plant stems. And on the right of that slide, I have an example. It's a Seratina bee, which is a really small carpenter bee, nesting in a blueberry cane. And about 1% of the native bees are bumblebee species. And these bees form small colonies in hollow cavities. And sometimes they're above ground, sometimes they're below ground. Lots of times they're in old rodent holes, actually. So, just looking at those photos, it's not always obvious where bees are living. These nesting spaces are in the soil, in plant stems, and wood. So where bees live in and around our homes, gardens, and urban spaces aren't always obvious, as I said. So when we're thinking about how we're managing these spaces, it's really important to consider and be thinking about the needs of bees as well. So I also wanted to quickly touch on honeybees. So these are probably the bees that many people are most familiar with, but the European honeybee, or Apis mellifera, isn't a native species in the Americas. It's also very different from many of our native bees. Honeybees are social. They have a caste system, meaning they have a queen, workers, and drones, and they have colonies that are long-lived and live from year to year. Honeybees overwinter by feeding on honey stores, and beekeepers keep honeybees in hives and manage them oftentimes for crop pollination. So they're moved from field to field and sometimes even trucked across the country. You've probably seen bees on flatbed trucks, getting taken to a new field. And these managed hives of European honeybees are responsible for much of the large-scale crop pollination that we have in this country, but there's trouble in relying on a single pollinator for pollination. It makes the system fragile. Honeybees are challenged by parasites, pathogens, diseases, pesticides, and poor nutrition, but because they're a managed species, they're not on the verge of extinction or anything like that. But because of this, more and more attention has been paid to encouraging conservation of wild bees, especially because many of them are just as efficient or even more efficient at pollinating as honeybees are. There just tends to be a lack of habitat in many landscapes for our wild bee species. So what can we do to build spaces for pollinators to thrive? There's 3 basic habitat requirements that are the same in all spaces, including our focus with you all today: urban centers, residential landscapes, the places where we work and live and play. So where we find opportunities for protecting, improving, building new habitat for pollinators within these spaces might vary a little bit, but in the end, what bees need are food, shelter, and refuge from pesticides. So food for bees is the flowering plants that provide the pollen and nectar that they subsist on. Shelter is those undisturbed spaces to nest in, whether it's in the ground or in plant stems. So that's kind of I'm sorry about that, I keep accidentally moving slides. So that's kind of the base of the pyramid for pollinator protection. You need a healthy habitat. But to keep that habitat healthy, you need to protect that habitat from pesticides. So pollinator habitat should include a diversity of flowering plants to provide resources for different pollinators and flowers that bloom throughout the season from spring until fall. So choosing a range of plants with different bloom periods provides food for pollinators throughout the seasons. Flowers in the spring and fall are especially important for bumblebees because that's when the queen bumblebees emerge and are actively foraging for food. But different native bees are active at other different times throughout the year. So it's really important to provide forage for them from the spring until the fall. Native species are particularly good for pollinator plantings because they're often adapted to the local climate. It can support specialist pollinators and habitat plantings. And I encourage you to look at planting lists like the ones we provide if you're interested in installing habitat plantings. We have some great regional suggestions. As every flower hasn't evolved to be pollinated by bees. So some aren't the best to provide resources for pollinators. And again, yes, different flowers, I'm saying pollinators and then bees, but syrphid flies, butterflies, there's a host of other insects that also provide pollination services. So pollinators and other invertebrates need undisturbed nesting areas. So for those ground nesting bees, this means leave bare soil. So don't plant or mulch every square inch of your property. Leave some bare patches for ground nesting bees to create their tunnels. Studies have actually found that ground nesting bee populations are depressed in cities because they have a lack of places to create nests. Everything is covered in impermeable surfaces like cement, asphalt, and then we do tend to mulch a lot in the open spaces that we do have in cities. So this is particularly important in urban areas. Cavity nesting bees also need nesting substrates. So plant plants with pithy or hollow stems. So caneberries, asters, roses are great examples. And then leave these up over the winter, since the immature bees are actually overwintering within those stems. And then in the spring, you can cut the stems back, but don't throw them away or compost them. Leave them in a pile on the side in case any bees have yet to emerge. And you can also leave leaves. So leave a thin layer of leaves on grassy areas. You can also spread them on flower beds for soil building and even weed protection, or pile them around ornamental trees, shrubs, perennials for mulch. So this can provide habitat and also overwintering sites for butterflies and many other beneficial insects that need shelter. So another important consideration is to include host plants for butterflies that are native to your region in your garden or landscape. So many of our native butterfly species are specialists when they're caterpillars, and they can only develop on the leaves of a specific plant species. A great example from the San Francisco Bay Area that you aren't likely to attract to your yard, unfortunately, is the mission blue butterfly, which is found in the Marin Headlands, down in Pacifica a little bit. And as caterpillars, they can only feed on a couple species of native lupin. But there's a number of similar species that are restricted to lupins or more broadly to plants in the legume family. There's other common examples, monarchs that can only develop on milkweeds, pipeline swallowtails on pipeline plants. So including plants that provide these valuable resources to some of these specialists that might be in your area is really essential. And then these flowers then provide quality nectar sources for pollinators and other beneficial insects like lady beetles, parasitic wasps, syrphid flies, pirate bugs. They all will use those resources as well as adults. So I quickly also want to mention plant selection. So it's best to avoid double flowered hybrids or other kind of ornate modern varieties or cultivars because a lot of these actually produce little or no pollen or nectar. Garden varieties are often bred for characteristics that are desirable to humans, but not to bees. So all plants aren't equal for pollinators. Just because it blooms doesn't mean it gives pollen or nectar. And just because it provides pollen or nectar doesn't mean bees will like it. So many of our pollinators use visual cues like color or patterns on flowers to identify plants. And if a plant is bred to have a different color or a pattern, that cue can be lost. Some horticultural varieties and hybrids have been bred for double petals, which loses the plant's ability often to produce nectar or pollen, or can just physically exclude a bee from being able to access the middle of the flower. And then finally, another thing to consider with plant selection is to seek out plants that haven't been treated with pesticides during propagation. And this isn't an easy thing to find out, and Sharon will talk more about this in her portion of the talk. Okay, so despite what I just told you about pollinators and other insect declines, paradoxically, cities can actually support a surprisingly abundant and diverse bee population. And the reason for this is gardens and parks. So we plant these areas with flowers, which are of course, the base of what bees need. And we don't just have flowers blooming one time of the year. We like having, beautiful flowers in our open spaces and yards, from spring until fall, which is, really essential for providing pollinator habitat. There's also been studies that suggest that, some urban areas can have lower pesticide exposure than agricultural areas. But of course, this is only when these areas are managed correctly and pesticides aren't used. So some of these places in cities can kind of serve as a refuge for pollinators and other insects. And because of this, urban gardens really have a high conservation potential for pollinators, which is really exciting. And an even greater potential if we design and manage these spaces, thinking about the needs of these species. So what can homeowners, park managers, what can we do? So gardens and parks really are a big potential tool in species conservation, as I just mentioned. Yards alone are about 25 to 30% of US urban land area. So that doesn't even include, park area. And this is really a huge amount of land within this already impacted landscape. So the potential of these spaces to provide habitat is really huge. Studies have shown that even small urban habitat patches have conservation value. So the individual gardener or landscaper can really make a difference. But if a number of parcels all provide habitat kind of nearby, they can scale up from the lot to the landscape level and provide connected habitat across this whole urban landscape, reducing fragmentation, providing corridors to remnant natural habitat, and just increasing ecosystem function and resilience. But again, to do this, yards have to be managed appropriately. So just kind of wanted to touch on some places beyond the stereotypical garden that are opportunities to increase pollinator and other insect habitat in urban areas. So one of these are parking strips, or kind of that median between sidewalks and streets. And these are often just kind of sad turf grass that provide zero habitat value, but they really can support robust communities of native plants. These are recognized as difficult places to grow plants, and native pollinator plants are a really great choice if you pick adapted drought-tolerant versions that won't need a lot of maintenance or irrigation or fertilization. You can also add logs or rocks, leave sections of bare soil to provide nesting resources for bees. And this is what I've done at my apartment here in Corvallis, Oregon. I've been able to install a lot of really great native plants that look nice and provide habitat right along the street. Bioswales are another location with value, with potential value, I should say, within urban areas. If they're planted with appropriate plants. These can also help with other conservation goals like creek protection, and many native species can do well in these locations. But I do want to note and warn with bioswales and catchments that they can be easily contaminated by chemical runoff, pesticides. So the pros and cons should be weighed when installing plantings in these locations. So if one's really close to say a golf course or another potential source of pesticide contamination, maybe that's not the best place to create habitat that's going to draw beneficial insects in and potentially harm them. Commercial landscaping. So this is another great place. Many native plants can really be just as pretty as ornamentals. And there's a lot of gorgeous examples of landscapes created with just habitat plantings. But I should also note that habitat gardening doesn't have to be a all or nothing proposition when picking plants. Landscapes can be designed with some, ornamental species with habitat plantings mixed in. And again, if the correct plants are chosen, the right plant in the right place, as we say, this will reduce the need for irrigation, which is a nice benefit as well. And again, it's important to use a variety of flowers to extend the bloom period throughout the spring, summer, fall, and to include butterfly host plants. So finally, it might seem obvious, but parks are a prime location for pollinator habitat. There's really an opportunity to replace some ornamentals with plants that have more habitat value. And then also with these larger patch sizes, there's the opportunity to create larger habitat that can support more diverse, large, abundant communities of insects, and even link these to existing remnant habitat when possible. And these large areas also have more room for a diversity of nesting resources. And there's also the opportunity to have public engagement through interpretive signage or volunteer events. So I also want to mention biodiversity one more time before the end of my section. So I guess simply put, landscaping choices just have huge, wide-reaching impacts on biodiversity. And I want to stress that created habitat for pollinators will also provide habitat for a whole host of other insect species. These plants provide food and refuge for insects, as well as birds and mammals, and provide the base of subsequent interactions. Again, kind of think of that food chain or food web. And if a yard or park is nothing but a lawn filled with pesticides, you're going to have very few insects. And insects are what provide pollination, pest control, from species like ladybugs and parasitoid wasps. And then in turn, there will be no food for birds or small mammals to eat. There have been studies that have found native plants and landscaping can increase native insect abundance and diversity. And in turn, this results in more birds in these yards with native plants in their planting palette. So this kind of illustrates how the plant choices made at one site really can have direct cascading impacts on the entire local ecosystem. I also want to, again, mention how landscaping in cities can support individual insect species in addition to overall biodiversity. And again, an example that most people are familiar with are, monarchs on milkweed. Planting milkweed species can help provide habitat for these, imperiled pollinators. But again, another example, pipeline swallowtails, which are gorgeous insects, but can only develop on the California pipeline in California. And including these in your garden can help support these specialist butterflies. And I mentioned this just to show how urban habitats can be designed to support both specialists and overall biodiversity, which I think is really important and exciting. Okay, so earlier I mentioned the 3 habitat needs for pollinators and other insects. I covered food and nesting habitat, talked about the importance of plant choice, but I didn't talk about another really important part, reducing the exposure to pesticides. Especially, this is important in cities and towns. So my colleague Sharon will take over from here and talk about reducing reliance on pesticides.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to share my screen now. While I'm doing that, I just want to mention that a friend of mine sent me a video of a pipevine swallowtail that she recorded over the weekend down in San Francisco, and it was just amazing. So, are you all seeing my screen? And does it look right?
Perfect, Sharon.
Okay, awesome. Well, I want to say thank you so much, ReScape, for all the great work that you're doing down there in the Bay Area, and for inviting Aaron and me into this really valuable Earth Day celebration and educational event. I'm going to talk a little bit about reducing reliance on pesticides through ecologically based IPM. And landscapes in towns and cities and natural areas do make a huge contribution to biodiversity, as Aaron has talked about. So it's important to think about how we manage these landscapes, taking a look at our weed, insect, and disease management. And this can be a tricky thing. It can be hard to get everybody on board. And so my goal is to help you gain a framework for how to do this and show you some real world examples so that your pest management programs can be successful and with strong acceptance. So let's dive in. I don't know exactly who's on the call, but from looking at the registration list earlier, it looked like a lot of people who had signed up were people who worked in landscaping. I'm sure others of you are gardeners. So I'm imagining that most, if not all of you, have some training or familiarity with integrated pest management. IPM, as we call it, was really developed to reduce the need for pesticides. And some people even call it intelligent pest management. What it is that it emphasizes preventing pests first, and doing so by seeking to eliminate the underlying causes of plant diseases, weeds, and insects, rather than relying on routine use of pesticides to solve the problem. So why are we talking about ecologically based IPM? What does it mean? Is there really a need to put an ecological perspective into pest management? And what do places for people, such as cities, have to do with ecology anyway? Does ecology even include people? I know I'm asking some provocative questions of this group, but so I'm trying to advance my slide and it is being stubborn and not moving. So I'm going to start talking a little bit while I wait for the PowerPoint to catch up. So ecologically based IPM is IPM, but it considers species as a really integral part of that. Basically, conserving the habitats and species and processes that sustain life and biodiversity, and by extension, us. We're looking for integrated pest management that's safe for non-target beneficial organisms. And to those who use or work on the landscape, the people who are doing the work. IPM in an ecological view should also be sustainable economically and durable over time. So I'm still having trouble advancing.
Sharon, do you want to quit it?
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, yeah. So I basically just went over that slide, so I'm going to jump to the next. So you might be asking, is it really my responsibility as a landscaper or gardener? Why take on that extra challenge of trying to do ecologically based IPM? Well, Erin talked about the challenges and declines that many pollinator and other insect species are facing. And I want to point out another piece of the puzzle. We find pesticides just about everywhere we look, all over the landscape. And this is due to the widespread and regular use of pesticides. So we find pesticides in natural habitats, on crop margins and beyond, in honeybee hives, in soils, in rivers and streams. In fact, rivers and streams in urban areas tend to be actually more polluted by pesticides than those in ag areas. And in the Midwest, a typical stream sampled in 2013 contained 25 pesticides as documented by the USGS. So why does this happen in urban areas? It has a lot to do with the hardscapes that are typical of urban areas. You know, we've got pavement and driveways and roofs and all that just drive water into the streams. But when we end up with mixtures like this, 25 different pesticides in rivers and streams, pesticides that are applied to the soil that stay there, we don't really know how mixtures interact. So to counteract the risk of pesticides being pretty ubiquitous in our environment, including in the urban environment, we do need to think about our own contribution to this issue. Another reason to think about ecologically based pest management is that 98% of insects are not pests. And this may catch you by surprise, given how much attention pest species get and the cultural conditioning that we all get as Americans to sort of go, ooh, gross, you know, when we think about insects. Maybe not you guys, many of you are really attuned to this issue, but I'm sure you've noticed that most Americans do have this reaction to insects. So when we think about the roles that are played, you know, as Erin went over, we've got insects that are vital for food for other species. They're recycling nutrients. They are doing important roles like processing cattle feces. And so remember that question, does ecology even include people? Yes, we rely on insects to do all these things. For instance, in Australia, the plant waste, I don't know, that went ahead. In Australia, they didn't have, when the cows were first introduced there, they didn't have insect fauna to process cattle feces. And so rangeland across the country was fouled by slowly decomposing dung. And so they had to import dung beetles from elsewhere. So that's just one example of the roles and the benefits that insects play in the human world. And by the way, you're going to hear me use the word pest a lot in this presentation. And I want to remind you that when I say pest, I'm thinking not just of insect pests, but also of diseases and weeds. We use that term broadly. And similarly, when I say pesticide, I'm referring not just to insecticides, but also to fungicides, herbicides, and other kinds of sides. And I also just want to say that the idea of a pest is really a human construct. It represents something that humans don't really want in our spaces. But often outside of the areas where there may be conflict, the species may not be a problem at all. As an example, mice in the woods are fine, in our buildings, not so much. Another reason to be focused on ecologically based pest management is that urban areas, including urban parks and residential areas, hold a lot of potential for bee conservation more than previously thought. There can be exceedances of rural areas and diversity and abundance of bees, for example. Also, pesticide use can have far-ranging unintended consequences. Many of you may know about the largest mass pesticide poisoning of bumblebees that was ever documented. It happened about 13 miles from where I live in Wilsonville, Oregon, just a few years back in 2013 during Pollinator Week. 50,000 bumblebees were poisoned when linden trees were treated with a neonic in a Target parking lot, a shopping center. And the people who put this on probably didn't realize what an impact they would have. The application they probably thought was a good thing. They were trying to kill aphids that were dripping honeydew on cars in the parking lot. And so they didn't mean to kill all those bees, but it's a great example, unfortunately, of recognizing that when we apply pesticides, there can be unintended consequences that can be quite large. So I hope these examples help answer that question. Do we even need to think about ecology if it's a highly developed area? The answer is yes. There's a lot living there, and a lot of reasons why. There might be a better way to think about whether we actually have a problem and whether we actually need pesticides. Also, as we start to think more broadly about managing landscapes to benefit pollinators and biodiversity, it's helpful to realize this. Did you know that giving more attention to protecting and expanding habitat for native pollinators also comes with its own benefits for pest control? Many so-called natural enemies that eat or parasitize pests also consume pollen. So adding flowers for bees or butterflies also lays the groundwork for a healthy population of natural enemies who will control pests. This photo here is of a crab spider, which is a good natural enemy on a variety of pests, including this fly. So let's switch angles for a second and let's talk about aesthetics for a minute. Aesthetics are a big driver of human behavior, right? Especially in mating behavior, as we all know very well. So let's take a brief detour and consider that old saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In Southeast Asia, in some traditional cultures, teeth stained black by betel nut chewing, as demonstrated on the woman on the left, are considered very beautiful. What about the woman on the right? Not long ago, she, with a prominent tattoo on her neck, would probably have been seen as quite shocking and maybe even ruining her looks. But now, if you're an American in your 20s and you don't have a tattoo, you might not be able to be, considered cool enough to even find a date. So aesthetics is very, very subjective. And so I bring this up because concepts of beauty are also really important drivers of our landscape practices. But what kind of aesthetic? And does it serve us well? Well, let's look at this landscape. For many people, it might be considered quite beautiful, but for that picture perfect, ultra manicured look, you can guess that it's maintained with a lot of herbicide, probably a lot of fungicide, and probably some insecticide too. And ironically, you can see that it lacks that biodiverse habitat that Erin just mentioned that is so important for pollinators and all the other species that rely upon insects in general. So using pesticides primarily to maintain a perfect aesthetic is something called cosmetic use. And given what we know, we have to question whether cosmetic use justifies its unnecessary environmental risks. In fact, cosmetic use is not the norm in many places. 80% of Canadians live in provinces where cosmetic use is not allowed. So another way to tackle reducing pesticide use is by eliminating cosmetic use wherever possible. Rethinking what we call a weed or another pest and where can go a long ways. And thinking about habitat for wildlife can have the same effect. In fact, we know that bees like their habitat a bit messy. Bumblebees, for example, will often choose nesting in overwintering sites that have undisturbed sites and have overgrown vegetation. So as you examine your pest management practices, whether you're managing a park or your own landscape, ask yourself, how much of my pesticide use might be just to maintain a standard of beauty that might be out of date and ecologically harmful. So you may be thinking, great, but doesn't this mean that I'm going to be getting a lot more complaints about weeds and other pests? Well, science shows that IPM works. This slide shows 3 studies that show that strong commitment to IPM practices can significantly reduce pest incidents and complaints and pesticide use over time. There was a study at Bethpage State Park Golf Course in New York, a 9-year project. As Erin mentioned, golf courses are sort of infamous for using a ton of different pesticides of many different kinds, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides. They reduced the pesticide environmental impact rating by 50 to 95%. And the IPM managed areas compared to the conventionally managed areas actually had similar quality, similar satisfaction ratings by users. So no decline in quality, no increase in complaints. Similar studies by the National Park Service. They actually did a great study on rat populations, putting into place a lot of different cultural practices. They filled rat holes, they changed the design of garbage cans, and they increased the frequency of garbage pickup, reduced the rat populations over time. Cockroaches in buildings managed by the US government, they reduced the number of cockroach complaints by more than 93%, while at the same time eliminating the use of spray insecticides and reducing solid insecticides by 95%. Pretty impressive stats in those studies. Now, ultimately, San Francisco has certainly seen a difference as well. They have been tracking their pesticide usage from 2010 until now, and their tracking revealed a 97% reduction of their highest hazard pesticides in pounds since in that time, over 10 years. And this reduction occurred across landscape types, as you see on the right, but especially in their golf courses and parks and facilities. However, to look at the big picture, they do note that the lower hazard pesticides have risen as replacements over that same time period. One thing to keep in mind, especially those of you who work in parks and managers in particular, the San Francisco IPM manager insists that theirs is not a pesticide reduction program, it's a harm reduction program. They looked at hazard and tried to eliminate those that were the highest hazard. For example, did they ban glyphosate, better known as Roundup, like many cities are doing? No, but they did also reduce its use by more than 98%. So let's look now at the principles and methods behind this concept of ecologically based IPM. So 3 principles can be used to help you solve pest problems while minimizing pesticide reliance. First, prevention. Prevention is about addressing those root causes of pest issues. Prevention gets you ahead of the game by eliminating the conditions that favor pests. And so prevention practices are oriented toward ensuring that pest populations don't get out of control. It's about use of non-chemical management strategies, such as mechanical or physical disruption of the pest, cultural practices that might change the timing of certain practices, use different plant species, etc. I'll go over several examples in a couple minutes. Monitoring or assessing the pressure of your pests is a second principle. You need to understand what pests are out there and if the pressure or conflict with people even warrants intervention. So this means observing and tracking pest pressure regularly, which helps you see if your non-chemical prevention methods are working and if you can continue to manage the pest with low impact methods. Thinking about pest pressure is also important for reducing reliance on pesticides. In your IPM plan, we invite you to consciously make choices about when and where a pest is enough of a problem to justify the use of a pesticide. So the third principle we call limiting harm. In some cases, there may be pests that defy prevention management and they move above tolerable levels. So Xerces doesn't encourage the use of pesticides, but if you find that you are going to apply a pesticide, it's important to understand how to limit the harm. And that can take 2 angles. First, reducing the risk of exposure, And second, by using pesticides of lower toxicity. Together, these can help overall to reduce your reliance on pesticides. So notice, I'm not just talking about substituting good chemicals for bad chemicals. Sometimes people think that substituting a newer product that may be hyped by a pesticide salesperson as being green is what IPM is all about. That's not the approach that Xerces recommends, at least not exclusively. So let's look at a few non-chemical prevention strategies. This is a 30,000 foot level. A lot of these you might be already familiar with through implementing right plant, right place, take care of the soil, don't spread weeds or disease propagules, make it easy to be sanitary, pruning, and so on. If you're talking about insect management, not having garbage all over the place that might attract things like yellow jackets, etc. So these are just a few examples. If you've got invasives, emerging pests, it's really important to consult the experts to know those really site-specific and pest-specific management practices that may work for prevention for emerging pests or invasives. Let's look at some examples for monitoring. Again, knowing which pests are in your system, what habitats they're occupying, tracking their pressure, and determining whether the pressure is at a point that might trigger interventions such as pesticide use. So this step requires that your staff, if you're managing a park, or an individual, if you're managing your home landscape, have some skill in identifying weeds, insects, and diseases. And you understand the life history of those weeds, insects, and diseases, or that you can pull in somebody who can. So monitoring may be about doing inspections to note the presence and abundance of the pest itself. A couple of the examples shown in pictures here show that, like up in the upper left, there's an example of dragging through a sort of overgrown field to start to detect ticks. Not start to detect tick presence and abundance. There's also an example shown here of using a sticky band on a tree trunk to detect an invasive spotted lanternfly. That's a pest that is basically at this point prevalent on the East Coast. Also, turning a leaf over to look for the presence of pests like whiteflies or aphids underneath. You might use this technique in your garden, for instance. But also you want to look for pest conducive conditions. This checklist that's shown up here on the upper left is designed for facilities. I just show it here because it's a great example. And so pest conducive conditions can vary from site to site. In outside environments, you might look at things like testing soil chemistry and biology on a sports field. For a facility, you might be noting where overdue maintenance might be setting you up for pest issues such as water getting into your structure. So one thing I do want to note here before we move on is that when you're doing this step, really having a little bit of knowledge can really help a lot. So you see these bites taken out of this leaf here. This is actually a sign of a leafcutter bee, not a pest per se, so this is actually a bee that is taking little bites out of a leaf so that they can use it to separate cells in the nest. And so knowing the signs of the pests that might be actually harmful in your area versus those that might not be harmful is a good thing to know. So let's go to that third principle, limiting pesticide harm. I talked about toxicity risk and exposure risk. When we talk about toxicity risk, we're thinking about how toxic is it? Is there a potential for mortality? Is there a potential for those sublethal effects that Erin mentioned right at the beginning? Typical reproductive or sublethal effects might be reproductive diminishment, cancer, a change in learning ability. Sometimes people think sublethal effects, if it doesn't kill you, maybe it makes you stronger. That's not necessarily true. A really good example of sublethal effects that we may all be familiar with is DDT. It thinned out raptor eggshells. And that thinning of the eggshells actually almost drove the bald eagle and other raptors in the United States toward extinction. And so sublethal effects may not directly kill an animal, but over time, it can actually have just as profound an effect on the species. So when we look at toxicity, we think of not just mortality, but also those sublethal effects. We also know, keep in mind that pesticides can affect different groups of wildlife differently. What is toxic for insects may not be toxic for people, and vice versa. So just a few overviews. Exposure risk. Exposure, again, is something that you need to think about from the standpoint of people, pets, but also when you're thinking about insects from their perspective. And one important principle is that even if people or pets or pollinators aren't around when an application occurs, exposure can still occur later. You can have a baby eating food in contact with pesticide residue. That's actually my son in the picture on the right, eating a snack before I actually was smart enough to realize that we shouldn't put picnic food on the grass in the park that probably had been treated with herbicides. For bees, you can see we've got some examples down here of bees being sprayed directly, or visiting flowers that may have been sprayed before, or may have been treated with systemic pesticides that actually get inside the plant and can remain for a long time inside plant tissue. There's also skin contact and breathing vapors, as shown in the photo on the left, with the baby in contact with potentially contaminated soil or plant tissue that is actually gassing off pesticide. These are all, and to some extent, hypothetical examples. I mean, these are not necessarily something you're going to encounter in every landscape every day, but these are all potential exposure risks when pesticides are used. So limiting that in a city or a municipality, there's many techniques: pesticide-free parks, advanced notification, not applying pesticides during bloom, stopping routine hidden pesticide uses such as fertilide, pesticide combo products, etc. I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to go a little bit more quickly, but I want to show you two important examples just to illustrate how this works. So this first example, you can see that athletic field weeds is the example, and we talk about what prevention methods can you use to prevent this problem. Athletic fields get a lot of heavy use that promotes wear and tear, bare spots, weeds. Sometimes that can mean that holes develop in the soil that can trip up players. So this tends to be an area where people who work for parks districts or schools get really concerned and may apply a lot of herbicide in particular. But there are many cultural practices that can be used by feeding the soil, mowing high, proper irrigation, overseeding, aerating, etc. For monitoring, you're going to want to look for not only the weed presence, but also monitoring the soil chemistry and biology. And weed species action thresholds can really vary depending upon the species and location. And this whole thing can change over time. For instance, we know now that microclovers are actually considered beneficial, but in the past they were considered a weed. Actually, clover was considered a weed, but there have been different varieties that have been developed that can really reduce irrigation need and the fertilizer need, as well as providing some habitat. For limiting pesticide harm, avoiding pre-emergence, which is sort of like a pesticide that you put on to prevent the germination of weeds. That is sort of like putting on a pesticide before you even know if you're going to have a problem. You can also mow prior to any treatments to remove the blooms. The northeastern states have a lot of great examples of organic turf management. And if you work in a park district or school district, I would recommend that you look into what's going on in northeastern states, and you can get lots of great information there. Let's look at an example that is common in San Francisco and the Bay Area. On trees, there's many different bark beetles that affect a lot of different tree species. On pines, such as the Monterey pine in the Bay Area, the turpentine bark beetle, or the Ips beetle, are two common beetles. And so some prevention practices is to maintain tree vigor. Supplying enough water is really important. Not stressing existing trees when development occurs by crowding trees and paving over their root systems or building structures that might actually compromise their root systems. Pruning for damage that might occur should only occur between November 1st and mid-February, because the adults can fly in between February and November, and the pruning damage can actually attract beetles in. Also, disposing of any infested limbs via burning or chipping so that you're not actually just creating more habitat on site, and being smart when planting. For monitoring for bark beetles, different species have different signatures. It's kind of important to examine frequently. Each 1 to 2 months is ideal. Like for the turpentine beetle, the pitch tubes and the boring dust for turpentine would be signs that you would look for. For the foliage, different species would harm foliage. You may want to peel back some bark and examine galleries under bark. Interestingly, for bark beetles, insecticide treatments basically won't work if the trunk is already extensively attacked. But like turpentine beetles don't necessarily mean that the beetle is going to be killed. Many trees can actually survive some pressure. What is recommended is sort of a prevention treatment on like the lower bark for turpentine beetles, for example. But the ones that are labeled for this use are highly toxic on contact to pollinators. And so if you are going to use them, consider other flowering plants within, say, a 50-foot radius and mow or clip the flowers. And the recommended spray time for this species is only mid-February through mid-March. It's not going to be very effective outside of that window. But you may not even need or want to use a bark spray. These are really just recommended if you have a really valuable tree that is susceptible, because you know that you've got the beetles in the local area, and this tree is very valuable, maybe due to its age, its position in the landscape, and so on. So this shows you just a couple of small examples about how you can apply this framework to different pest species. Oh, really quick, I want to show you a quick video here. Hopefully this will show for you guys. Did everyone get a chance to see that? Did that come through? I never know with videos if there's going to be enough internet bandwidth.
Yeah, it came through. No sound though.
Oh, no sound. Okay, I'm so sorry. Well, basically that was a little Forest Service video showing that a defense mechanism that trees have to basically push out bark beetles and boring insects is by producing pitch, which they use to actually push the beetles out. But when trees are very drought stressed, which is very common in California now, they can't produce enough pitch to do that. So a really important prevention strategy is supplying trees in urban areas with enough irrigation. And so just sort of a reminder about how important that prevention practice is. Okay, just a couple of last slides and then we can go to questions. We recommend that you think beyond maintenance as well and try to buy plants that are non-toxic. So if you work for a municipality, we recommend that you have a purchasing policy, and that if you are buying plants for your own landscape, for your residents, that you think about the steps that you can take. So we recommend that you seek out organic plants and seeds whenever you can. We know that these are not necessarily widely available at this time, but there are a few growers here and there. And the more that people ask, the more likely it is that the growers are going to respond to that demand. Secondly, we recommend that people avoid plants grown with neonicotinoids and other similar systemic insecticides. And third, very importantly, you may encounter people who are not that familiar with what's used or what steps they have been taken in the growth, but to ask the questions and to let people know, I want plants that are grown without pesticides that might be harmful to pollinators. What are you doing to enhance your pollinator-friendly pest management? So we have materials that you can learn more about this. We have a couple of fact sheets on this. We have postcards that you can distribute. We really encourage people to really start thinking about buying bee-safe plants. It's going to be really helpful overall for our landscapes and for nurseries to hear this message from people who want these kinds of plants. A couple of resources that might be useful to those of you who are working in urban landscapes are shown here. We've got a new pollinator-friendly parks publication. I talked about our buying bee-safe plants. Those of you who are maybe struggling with mosquito management, we have really great materials on that. Those of you who are restoring habitat might be interested in organic site preparation. Those of you who are managing cities and campuses, please take a look at our pollinator protection for cities and campuses. We've got other resources too. This is a new resources that we have about systemic insecticides. And you can, this is sort of a database, you can download a whole table about this and find information about toxicity, persistence, etc. This is a brand new resource, go take a look at it. Those of you who are wondering about that toxicity piece of limiting pesticide harm might be interested in some of these pollinator toxicity resources. The Bee Precaution Pesticides Rating Tool, which is great for ag and not so great for urban. The third tool down here, which is Pesticide Decision-Making Guide to Protect Pollinators in Landscape, Ornamental, and Turf Management out of Cornell, might be more helpful. We have a great resource about organic pesticides, etc. Anyway, I know that you're probably not able to scribble all these down or whatever, and we're happy to show the presentations later if you like. But anyway, these are a few toxicity resources. So thank you so much, ReScape. Thanks to all of you who came today. Xerces is a donor-supported nonprofit, and we always encourage people to become a member today. Member, if you like. You can go to that link right there if you're interested in that. And if you have any further questions that don't get answered today, you can contact us at pesticides@xerces.org. So thank you so much, and we're ready for questions.
Thank you, Sharon Selvaggio and Aaron Anderson, for a beautiful presentation and so dense with information as well. If we could just put that email in the chat thread, that would be awesome. I do encourage anyone who does have to leave, you can rewatch this obviously on the YouTube channel, or also reach out at partner@rescapeca.org. We can get you in contact with both Sharon and Aaron and Xerces. I do have a few questions to ask. This was during Aaron's presentation, but of course, answer however you feel appropriate. Simone Rosa said, here in Piedmont, Atlanta, bare ground doesn't stay bare when unmulched, and we've got hard clay in most yards. How do we leave bare ground and encourage ground nesters in this area?
Do you want to answer, Sharon, or do you want me to?
I think you would be better to answer that.
Yeah, and you might have, and feel free to obviously jump in, because I'm sure you'll have plenty to add. That's a hard one, and something that I've struggled with talking with landowners and home gardeners a bit over the years, and I think one thing is that these bare spots don't have to be huge, right? So they don't have to be like the entire side of your house, a huge plot. They can be a small meter squared plot, for example, and ultimately doing hand weeding or something like that to try and maintain some small sections of bare soil, I think is the best bet, because obviously, as Sharon covered, you don't want to apply herbicides. If you mulch, you're going to kind of create a barrier that's going to make it difficult for a lot of those native bee species to actually be able to access the soil. So yeah, it's a little bit of a labor of love, but I think just trying to pick a small section, it doesn't have to be something huge. And I think a place where you can kind of get a little bit of dual purpose out of your garden is, I've noticed under a lot of perennial species, they naturally kind of shade out a lot of, weed competitors. So under some of those areas, if you leave bare soil, bees can still access those. So those are a couple tips that I would suggest.
Great, thank you, Aaron. The next two questions are similar, both from Kelly Ambler and Irene Godfrey. Will cavity nesting bees use aromatic plants such as mints and parsley-like herbs? And Irene's question, will bees make use of old non-producing wild raspberry canes?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I've never heard anything about them not using mints as a nesting resource, because they're very popular for pollinators visiting and foraging for nectar and pollen. So yeah, I'd imagine they'd be perfectly happy to use a hollow mint stem. I think the one thing I would caution, especially the parsley-like herbs part of that question, is that you actually have to have a remnant stem that is going to provide a suitable sized cavity. So by the time you get to something that's too herbaceous and the stem is too small, you're really only going to be providing habitat for the smallest of bees, if any at all. It might be too small for any. So I think something to consider is having a variety of stem diameters, because different bee species, depending on their size, require different sized holes. So that's even if you're providing lots of people like mason bee houses or having a cluster of bamboo to provide habitat for a lot of those cavity nesting bees. And if you do that, providing different diameter hole sizes is really important, because depending on the species, they require a different size cavity. And then yeah, for old non-producing wild raspberry canes, I think that's a great resource for cavity nesting bees. I think they'll use something that's a couple years old. The one thing they won't do is reuse a cane or a stem after they've already nested in it 1 year. So, if you do have cavity nesting bees and they've emerged, then you can, feel free to, compost that stem or something, because they won't go back to that same stem.
It's wonderful. I'm so excited that we're having so many questions from all around our nation, which makes me feel so hopeful about everyone's interest in this. We have a question from Barbara Vinson, more specifically in Texas, treatment integrated pest management for fire ants. Any suggestions there?
Well, I would just say this to start off with. We are not necessarily experts on every pest across the country, because there's many, right? And so what I would encourage is looking into that framework and thinking about what might work in your particular area. I'm not all that familiar actually with fire ants in Texas, so I feel a little bit inadequate to actually answer the question specifically. But again, just thinking about, can you make the habitat less conducive? I don't know quite what that takes, again, because I'm not familiar with them, unfortunately. But is there a way to do that when you're monitoring, understanding what their life cycle is, what habitat needs that they have, and when they sort of like cycle and all of that kind of thing, if they're at a level or in a place that actually merits some kind of intervention. And the last thing, limiting pesticide harm, you may find that there's some low tech, low impact. Again, I wish I knew more about this particular pest, but if there's ways to either reduce the exposure risk through a very targeted treatment, if you have to do it, or by using lower toxicity products, that would be within keeping with that whole framework of ecologically based IPM.
And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as we go over these questions, as all of you have questions in your minds as they pertain to really specific things that you have in your yard, to really be students of your land. And also, I really encourage you so that you're not out there on your own trying to figure this stuff out and finding dead ends, please reach out to us. We will do our best to connect you with people that may be in your area or build community, networks that are in your area. We're actively seeking out new landing spots, and Xerces is all over. A lot of you are coming from a lot of little bases of Xerces all over the county. So great answer. Thank you, Sharon. I have a couple more questions. Yes?
Just a very quick follow-up on that. I forgot to mention that, particularly in California, but every state has resources available, but often the state extension services that are, through the university, like in California, it's University of California IPM program, fabulous resources. You can get a lot of great strategies there. Sometimes you conservation district, the county, it's soil and water conservation districts at the county levels, are excellent for invasives as well. There's a variety of different places, but we do recommend that you look for science-based information when you're looking for those prevention practices and monitoring practices.
Great. And there is a little follow-up that Barbara just dropped in the chat thread I'm going to read. And just a heads up that we are 2 minutes until 1:30. If you do need to leave, feel free. Aaron and Sharon, if you're available for another few minutes, I'll just keep asking the questions. So the follow-up is from Barbara. Thank you for addressing fire ants. There are several research projects on introducing a parasite to address controlling them. And I'm wondering if there's any feedback on your opinion, Sharon or Aaron, on that.
Well, I'll just jump in on that, and Aaron may have something to say. These are exotic species, correct? I'm not that familiar with them, but I think I remember hearing that they're exotic. So I'm wondering if this introduced parasite is coming from the place where the fire ant is itself native. And that would be an example of classical biocontrol. It's been done successfully in many places. It's something that is, continues to be done. There are some places where biocontrol or that kind of classical method has resulted in unexpected, unintended consequences, because sometimes the introduced agent can have a broader effect than what you're anticipating, not just on the pest itself. So we know that USDA, APHIS, and others who are involved in that kind of work are aware of those kinds of problems and really do try to minimize potential implementation issues, but it's something that I think all of us need to be aware of. There's rarely a silver bullet with pest management, and that's something that's really good to keep in mind. It's just because something might even be in development or in the research phase, we still all need to be thinking about those prevention practices as we can. And even after things like that might exist, because sometimes it takes a while for those kinds of imported biological controls to actually take hold in the landscape. They don't always actually take hold even. Aaron has a little bit of background in this too, so.
Yeah, no, I think everything you said, Sharon, was spot on. And I think, kind of talking about, that length of time, I think because of historical unintended consequences, now the USDA is super rigorous with, research, quarantine lab testing, and permitting. So, even if trials are going on, sometimes it can be a decade before things are even permitted to be released. And on top of that, it's unlikely to be something that, you can just put in your yard and control it in your yard. It would be more of a kind of holistic, landscape-wide, reduced levels, as opposed to something that, as Sharon was saying, unfortunately isn't a silver bullet that will just, take things, out of your own property. But yeah, I definitely echo to what Sharon was saying about, looking at resources from your, local extension agency and things like that, because they'll have the most up-to-date information for your particular location.
Thank you. I appreciate that thorough answer. I also want to mention that ReScape, we do have in our directory a lot of folks who are trained in IPM, and we are also doing an advanced workshop on integrated pest management. So check out our calendar, and we'll drop those links in there also to further that help. Next question is, this was during Sharon's part of the presentation. Irene Godfrey had a comment, and this is again specific. You had shown a photo Sharon, of the mosquito management plan that Xerces offers. There was kind of an anecdote of a child who died of West Nile, and then the county went really crazy spraying for mosquitoes and then really killed off a bunch of insect populations as a result. And this was in upstate New York. So a comment, but any comments you want to add to that, Sharon?
Yeah, mosquito management, like so many things, is really something that we all can play a role in. You know, especially in places where it rains a lot in the summertime, like in the Southeast United States. There's habitat all around our properties and gutters, places we might not even really think about. I mean, it wasn't until I came to Xerces that I realized, oh my God, gutters, you know, need to be cleaned out, partly because they actually help harbor mosquito habitat. Not so much where I live in Oregon, where we have a dry summer, but there's a lot you can do. You can look around your property for those places where water might be actually unable to drain in a space of 4 days. If water is basically available for 4 days or more, mosquitoes can breed in it. So, and if you've got places like pots outside that are, you know, collecting water, you know, garbage can lids, tires, gutters, you know, gutters should drain. I know it's very difficult. I have a 2-story house, like, oh my God, you know, I can't go out and look at my gutters. I need somebody else to do that because I'm afraid of getting on the roof these days, you know. But, you know, getting them cleaned regularly is just the most important prevention tactic. At the vector control, you know, district level, they should be monitoring larvae. They should have a really intensive larva. These materials that we have really talk about this. They should be, if they are monitoring that, knowing which mosquito species are in the area, and if they are mosquitoes that even carry disease. Not all mosquitoes do carry disease. Not all mosquitoes are pest mosquitoes. So they should have this kind of information through their monitoring program. If they need to treat, they should be treating at the larval stage, which means that they would not be doing widespread aerial insecticide spraying, having widespread impacts to all the insects in the county. So we recommend that you as individuals be aware of these things, think about your own private, you know, management of your own property, and work with your county vector control district or whatever scale they're at to investigate what are they doing? Are they using the best practices? So again, look at our resources. We've got some fabulous resources. You can take those and talk to your county vector district and help them improve their practices if they don't have them in place already.
Thank you. We will go for just a couple more minutes here. There are a couple more questions regarding specific IPM management things in areas. And so I will reach out to those people directly and include, you know, Sharon and Aaron in that if they'd like to. But again, to reiterate what both them, what Xerces is saying is to kind of investigate your local habitat, understanding how to mitigate those things. And I will direct you to the IPM advanced workshops that we're doing and the Xerces site. But I will go to Chris Durazo. He just had to leave for class about a half hour ago, but he's going to watch the replay. So is copper fungicide negatively impacting insects?
I don't know about that. Aaron, do you know?
You know, I don't. Yeah, I quickly looked it up in the bee precaution database, and you know, I didn't see you know, it being listed as, you know, one of the my impression is it's not one of the most concerning.
Gotcha.
I believe it is
yeah.
toxic, highly toxic to aquatic insects, I believe.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I remember looking into this years ago, but so yeah, we can get back to on that question or any others. Again, feel free to come. We're happy to help look into these a little bit more. Sometimes answering questions on the fly is a little bit challenging, but we're happy to help. Yeah.
And Chris is studying some, as I believe, some landscape management stuff at Merritt College here in Oakland. So he might be studying it too, and we'll see what he comes up with also. But
Okay.
So I'm going to skip ahead to, let's see here, Meredith Swatwart, excuse me. Are there any community programs, groups you know of that people in cities can sign up for to coordinate creation of native plant yards? Yeah.
I was gonna say,
weather, wildlife corridors. Yeah.
yeah, you can sign the Xerces Pollinator Protection Pledge. It's part of our Bring Back the Pollinators campaign. And here I can drop the link into the chat. And there's a map of all of the people with home gardens who have signed the pledge. So there's one resource. Sharon, I'm not sure if other ones come to the top of your head.
Yeah, there are examples in various places across the country. I'll mention up in Portland, Oregon here, which is where I live, there's a backyard certified habitat program that's run through the Audubon Society, and pesticide reduction is part of the certification system. It's a really great program. So if you're in the area, check that one out. And as well as planting native plants for attracting pollinators. In Santa Fe, there is a citywide, basically native plant, pollinator corridor project underway that is a great example. So you might want to check that out, or we can provide that resource, a link to that. There are neighborhood level kind of projects like this that are happening, and citywide projects like in Bee City, USA. So there's all kinds of examples actually around the country at different scales. And we'd love to hear about your examples, or else we can provide some, again, links if people want to contact us directly to look at any of those particular examples.
Yeah, and I think Kelly Ambler had dropped one in here. The Colorado Native Plant Society certifies native plant gardens. Community gardens, the UC Master Gardener, here UC, and natives nurseries. So yeah, please continue to drop those references into the chat thread as you know them, everyone. That brings me to the ends of my questions, which takes us right to 1:40, only 10 minutes over, which is amazing. If there is, anything else, I think everyone's gotten everything covered here. As people are dropping more into the chat thread, we will have to just cut it off at a certain point. And if you didn't get your question answered, please just feel free to reach out, partner@rescapeca.org. We are honored to hear from Sharon and Aaron. Ryan is going to take over and continuing to thank you too for being here. So I'll pass over to him.
Yeah, just so many thanks, right? Wow. I mean, if you're like me, you're probably feeling endlessly impressed and inspired by today's talk. And there's always so much more to learn. But again, thank you so much for attending this tremendously important presentation by Sharon and Aaron. I wish everyone on Earth could watch this talk. There is a wealth of knowledge to share, but it's apparent that we have to do it collectively. You can play a small part by sharing what you've learned with friends, families, neighbors, and colleagues. And with that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any additional questions. You can respond to us through our email at partner@rescapeca.org. It's our goal to provide you the resources to take action in practical ways and to get to know the community you're surrounded by. So we'd love to link you with any resources you're interested in, or any that came across in the chat or the talk today that you'd like to delve deeper in. I enjoy seeing so many familiar faces in the room and excited for the new participants who have joined us. This is a new program, but we are eager to keep improving. So please let us know if there's anything you'd like to see in the future, or if you're interested in getting involved in any way. Again, thank you, Sharon and Aaron. I wish you all the best moving forward. And thank you to our vendors and sponsors. Just a couple quick notes before we part ways. We're celebrating habitat creation this week for Earth Day, but it's also fun to note that the California Native Plant Society is also celebrating their own week honoring California native plants. So they have a California Native Plant Week celebration going on. I'm dropping the link into the chat. You can check out the link to find ways to get inspired and connect with others and enjoy the plants that California has made that have made California their home. With that as well, if you enjoyed today's presentation, we definitely encourage you to check out our upcoming talk in 2 days. This is on Thursday. We have Susan Karasoff and Bob Hall from the CNPS Yerba Buena chapter, and they'll be presenting Enhancing Biodiversity with Native Plants. It begins at 1 p.m. Pacific time. Just another kind of overlapping of the material today, but with some fresh voices and some new perspectives as well. Just so happy to have the participation that we've seen in the last week, and it shows that you all care. And so your presence today is even a small act of action as well. So again, thanks everyone for joining us, and hope to see you in some of the future talks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah. Aaron and Sharon, we will reach out shortly to connect with you.
Right.
Sounds great.
Thanks for being here. That was so amazing.
Thank you. Wonderful. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining.